In the heart of a vast, vibrant forest where the trees whispered ancient tales, there lived a bear named Barlow. Barlow was a bear of considerable size, with thick, soft fur, the color of honey and eyes that shimmered like the warm sun filtering through the canopy. But there was one thing about Barlow that set him apart from the other creatures in the forest. He was terribly shy. His shyness wasn't about speaking or meeting new faces. It was deeper. It was the quiet worry in his heart whenever he was asked to share something, anything at all. It was not that Barlow was unkind. On the contrary, he was gentle and had a heart as big as the forest itself. His friends loved him dearly for his warm hugs and his tendency to help others when they were in need. But Barlow had a secret. He had a stash of the sweetest, most delicious honey in all of the forest. He had found the honeycombs in a hidden grove, tucked away between tall trees, where the bees worked tirelessly day and night. The honey was golden and glimmered in the sunlight, more delightful than anything Barlow had ever tasted. The problem was, Barlow couldn't bring himself to share it. Every morning, Barlow would visit his special spot. The bees would buzz cheerfully around him, knowing well enough not to sting him. They had an unspoken understanding. Barlow would reach up with his large paws, careful not to disturb the delicate combs, and gently collect the honey, enough to fill a small, carved bowl he kept hidden beneath a pile of leaves. He'd sit there in the quiet of the forest, savoring each drop. Yet the more he ate, the more his heart felt heavy. Barlow had always been a solitary bear, preferring the quiet solitude of the forest to the noise and bustle of the other animals. But over time, he began to notice the little creatures that would gather near the grove, their noses twitching as they caught the scent of the honey. His rabbit friend, Thistle, often hopped by, looking longingly at the sweet golden liquid dripping from the trees. The squirrels would scamper across the branches above, whispering to each other about how delicious the honey must taste. "Barlow," Thistle would say, her soft brown eyes filled with hope, "why don't you ever invite anyone to share your honey? You must have so much." Barlow would lower his head, his paws tightening around his bowl. He knew that sharing the honey would bring joy to his friends, but the thought of offering even a small taste filled him with anxiety. What if they didn't like it? What if they took too much and left him with none? He couldn't bear the idea of losing something so precious. "No, no," Barlow would murmur, his voice a soft growl. "I like it here, by myself. I don't need to share." Days turned into weeks, and as autumn settled in, the forest transformed into a canvas of reds, oranges, and golds. The air grew crisp, and the animals of the forest began preparing for the coming winter. Barlow noticed that his friends were becoming busier. Thistle gathered acorns and nuts, the squirrels packed away their food for the long months ahead, and even the birds began migrating to warmer lands. But Barlow felt a growing emptiness inside. He would look at his honey stash and see the jars of sweetness sitting untouched, save for his own quiet indulgence. His friends didn't ask for it, but the longing in their eyes was unmistakable. Each time Thistle hopped past, she would pause, casting a wistful glance at the honeycombs that Barlow guarded so fiercely. "Wouldn't it be nice," Thistle once said, "if we could all enjoy something together? I think it would make the honey taste even sweeter." Her words stung Barlow's heart more than he cared to admit. He wanted to share, to give, but he feared that doing so would make him less special. The honey had become not just a treat, but a part of his identity, something that was entirely his own. He had convinced himself that if he shared it, it would no longer be his, that he would lose the joy he found in it. One evening, as Barlow sat near his honey grove, gazing at the glowing moon above, a fierce storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees and rain pounded against the earth in sheets. The forest, which had once felt like home, now seemed like a battleground, with trees bending under the force of the storm and branches crashing to the ground. Barlow huddled in his den, trying to shield himself from the wind, but his thoughts were filled with worry. His mind kept returning to his friends, the ones who had always been there for him, who had never once asked him for anything in return. What if they were out there in the storm, cold and scared? What if they needed the honey to survive? But as the hours passed, Barlow stayed hidden, unwilling to step outside. The thought of sharing, of giving up his precious honey, still filled him with dread. Instead, he waited, hoping the storm would pass. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a quiet, misty morning. The air smelled fresh, and the forest seemed to have been washed clean. As Barlow stepped outside, he felt a sense of unease. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows over the damp ground. Barlow's heart raced as he made his way to the grove, hoping the storm hadn't ruined the precious honey. To his surprise, Thistle was already there, shivering in the cold, her fur damp from the rain. "Thistle?" Barlow asked, his voice soft and uncertain. "What are you doing here?" "I was looking for you," Thistle replied, her voice small. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. I didn't want you to be alone in the storm." Barlow's heart swelled with a mix of guilt and gratitude. He had been so focused on himself, on keeping everything to himself, that he hadn't even noticed how his friends cared for him. "Are you all right?" Barlow asked, his voice thick with emotion. Thistle nodded, though she looked weary. "I'm fine, but I'm so hungry, Barlow. I don't have much food left. The storm ruined a lot of my stash." Without thinking, Barlow's gaze shifted to his honey stash. The thought of sharing it filled him with a sudden surge of warmth. He felt the weight of his selfishness and knew, deep down, that this was his chance to make things right. For the first time, Barlow didn't hesitate. He reached into the grove, took a jar of honey, and carefully poured it into a small carved bowl. The honey glistened in the morning light, golden and rich. "Here," Barlow said, his voice trembling. "I've been keeping it all to myself for too long. But you've always been there for me, Thistle. You deserve some too." Thistle's eyes widened with surprise. "You're really sharing it? After all this time?" Barlow nodded, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, I think it would taste better if we share it." Thistle's eyes filled with tears, and she took the bowl, her paws trembling slightly. "Thank you, Barlow. I've always known you had a big heart." The two of them sat together, sharing the honey and talking about the storm, the forest, and the future. The honey tasted sweeter than ever, not because of its richness, but because of the love and friendship that filled the space between them. And in that moment, Barlow understood. Sharing didn't take away from the sweetness. It only made it more meaningful. As the days passed, Barlow's heart felt lighter, and the heaviness that had once clung to him began to fade. He'd always feared losing something precious when he shared it, but now sharing the honey had given him something even more precious, the warmth of friendship. And something surprising began to happen. The forest itself seemed to respond to Barlow's newfound openness. It wasn't just Thistle who benefited from the honey. One by one, other animals began to visit Barlow's grove, and each time he found himself offering them a taste, his paws trembling at first but soon becoming steady. The rabbits, the deer, even the shy birds that flitted about in the treetops, all came to partake in the sweetness of the honey. Each time Barlow felt a little more at ease, his heart swelling with pride and joy. One crisp morning, as the first rays of light filtered through the trees, Barlow arrived at the grove to find a small crowd waiting for him. Thistle, the squirrels, and even a couple of deer stood near the entrance, their eyes hopeful. "Good morning, Barlow," Thistle greeted, her voice cheerful. "We were hoping you could share some of your honey with us. We've been gathering food all day, but nothing tastes as good as your honey." Barlow hesitated for a split second. His instinct was to retreat, to hold tight to the honey. But then he remembered the way his heart had felt when he shared it with Thistle. He smiled warmly and nodded, reaching for the jar. "Of course," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'd love to share." As he poured the honey into the bowls, a wave of warmth washed over him. The joy in his friend's eyes was more than enough reward. They laughed and chatted, exchanging stories of their harvests, and for the first time in a long while, Barlow felt like he belonged, truly belonged in this forest of friendships. The seasons shifted, and winter began to approach. The forest animals, having shared in the sweetness of Barlow's honey, prepared for the colder months. They had gathered enough food to last, but the bonds they had formed over the past few months were even more important than any stash of food. The true gift, they realized, was the gift of community, of standing together. One chilly afternoon, Barlow was walking through the forest, a little distracted by the sound of rustling leaves when he stumbled upon an unexpected sight. A large group of animals had gathered near the clearing. The squirrels were busy preparing acorn pies. The rabbits were setting up a large table made from fallen branches, and Thistle was decorating the area with vibrant wildflowers. It looked like something special was about to happen. "Thistle," Barlow called out, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's going on?" Thistle turned, her eyes shining with excitement. "Barlow, you're just in time. We're having a harvest feast to celebrate everything we've shared this year. You've taught us all a valuable lesson about kindness and generosity. This feast is for you." Barlow blinked, unsure of what to say. His heart raced as he looked at the colorful spread before him, filled with the best foods the forest had to offer. There were sweet berries, freshly picked mushrooms, nuts, and even more honey, all arranged beautifully in the center of the clearing. "Me?" Barlow asked, his voice small. "Yes, you," Thistle said, her smile wide. "You taught us that sharing makes everything sweeter, that there's more joy in giving than in keeping everything to ourselves." Barlow's chest tightened with emotion. The animals didn't just appreciate his honey, they appreciated him. And for the first time in his life, Barlow realized that he didn't have to hide. He didn't have to hoard things to feel loved or special. He already was, just as he was. As they all sat down together to share the feast, Barlow looked around at his friends, his true friends, and felt a warmth inside that no amount of honey could ever match. The food tasted sweet, but the laughter, the companionship, and the love that filled the air were even sweeter. Winter arrived quietly, with a blanket of snow covering the forest floor. The animals huddled in their dens, sharing stories and dreams of the spring to come. Barlow, who had once been so isolated, now spent much of his time with his friends, offering the warmth of his company as they all weathered the cold together. There was one particular night that Barlow would always remember. The snow had fallen thickly outside, and the wind howled through the trees. Inside his den, Thistle, a couple of rabbits, and the squirrels had gathered to keep warm. Barlow had a roaring fire going, its light flickering against the walls of the cave, and he had just finished telling a story of his own about a particularly adventurous day he had as a cub. "You were quite the mischievous little bear," Thistle said with a laugh, her eyes twinkling. "I can hardly imagine it, given how kind and gentle you are now." Barlow smiled shyly. "I suppose we all grow, don't we?" "Yes," Thistle replied, her voice soft but sure. "And some of us grow in the most surprising ways." The words lingered in the air as Barlow felt a wave of peace wash over him. He wasn't the bear he had been. He wasn't the shy, solitary creature who hoarded everything he had. He had opened his heart, and in doing so, had gained something more precious than honey. He had gained the love and trust of those around him. The fire crackled, and Barlow looked around at his friends, knowing that this winter would be different. It wouldn't be a season of isolation and solitude. It would be a season of shared warmth, shared food, and most importantly, shared hearts. As the first signs of spring appeared, with buds breaking through the icy ground and the air warming with the promise of new life, Barlow stood at the edge of his grove, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The bees were already busy at work, preparing the honeycombs once again, but Barlow didn't feel that old, familiar urge to hoard it. He no longer felt the need to keep everything to himself. In fact, he had been looking forward to the coming months, not because of the honey, but because he knew that no matter what the future held, he wouldn't have to face it alone. "Barlow," Thistle's voice called from behind him, "are you ready for the new season?" Barlow turned and smiled, his heart full. "I'm ready," he said, "and this time, I'm going to share every sweet moment." Together they headed toward the grove, where the bees were already humming with life, ready to begin another season of sweet honey. And as Barlow walked alongside his friends, he felt more connected to the forest and all its creatures than ever before. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that true sweetness doesn't come from what you keep to yourself, but from what you share with others. The warmth of the spring sun slowly seeped into the forest, thawing the last remnants of winter's chill. Barlow stood at the edge of his grove, taking in the lush green that now surrounded him. The trees were blooming, and the forest was alive with the sounds of new life. Birds chirped from their nests, and the river babbled merrily as it wound its way through the trees. The air was rich with the scent of wildflowers, and Barlow felt the peace of the forest settle into his heart. Barlow had always known that spring was a time for renewal, But this spring felt different. It wasn't just the flowers or the warmth of the sun. It was the change within himself. He was no longer the bear who hid in the shadows, fearful of sharing his treasures. Now he stood tall, not because of the honey he had or the friends he kept, but because of the way he had learned to embrace himself. Barlow's thoughts drifted to Thistle. She had become his closest friend, the one who had helped him take those first small steps toward opening his heart. She was the one who had shown him that friendship, like honey, was best enjoyed when shared. Barlow! Thistle's voice interrupted his thoughts. She was running toward him, her small form bouncing with excitement. Good morning, Thistle, Barlow greeted, smiling. I've been thinking, Thistle said, her ears twitching with energy. What if we started a new tradition in the forest? What if we held a spring festival to celebrate everything we've learned about sharing and kindness? Barlow blinked, surprised by the idea. A spring festival? Yes, Thistle exclaimed. We could gather everyone, every animal in the forest, and share food, stories, and even songs. We could invite all the little ones to help collect flowers and decorations, and everyone could contribute something special. It could be a celebration of everything that makes this forest so wonderful. Barlow's heart swelled at the thought. The idea of a festival, a celebration of everything they had built together, was exactly what the forest needed. It wasn't just about the honey or the food. It was about the connections they had all made, the way they had learned to live together and share what they had. That sounds wonderful, Thistle, Barlow said, his voice filled with warmth. I think it's a great idea. And so the preparations for the spring festival began. The entire forest seemed to come alive with excitement in the weeks leading up to the festival. Each animal played a part in the preparations, contributing what they could to make the event memorable. The rabbits collected bundles of wildflowers, their paws carefully arranging the blooms into colorful wreaths. The squirrels, always the industrious ones, gathered acorns, nuts, and berries to make delicious pies and tarts. Even the birds helped by decorating the trees with ribbons and bright feathers, creating a canopy of colors that hung above the clearing. Barlow, who had once been so shy about participating in group activities, found himself at the center of it all. He spent hours with Thistle, arranging tables made of tree branches and gathering the last of the honey. It was during this time that he realized something important. It wasn't just the act of sharing that had changed him. It was the act of being part of something bigger than himself. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was contributing to something important, something that would leave a lasting impact on the forest. The days flew by, and soon the day of the spring festival arrived. The forest was alive with activity. Barlow stood in the clearing, watching as the animals began to gather. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow over everything. The sweet scent of flowers mixed with the earthy smell of the forest, creating a feeling of peace and harmony. Thistle appeared beside him, her eyes sparkling with excitement. It's happening, Barlow, she said. Look at all these animals, all here to celebrate the forest and each other. Barlow smiled, his heart full. I never imagined it would be like this, he said, his voice soft. I never imagined it would be so beautiful. As the animals gathered, the atmosphere became one of joy and anticipation. The clearing was filled with laughter and chatter as the animals set out the food, laid out the blankets, and found their places. Barlow watched in awe as each animal took their turn sharing something special. The rabbits brought out the acorn pies, their golden crusts glistening in the sun. The squirrels offered their berry tarts, the sweetness of the fruit filling the air with its rich aroma. The birds sang songs of the forest, their melodies weaving through the trees like a gentle breeze. Even the bees, who had worked so tirelessly on their hives, joined in, buzzing around to add their hum to the symphony of sounds. Barlow took his place at the center of the clearing, surrounded by his friends. The bees, who had come to appreciate Barlow's kindness, had given him a special jar of honey as a gift. It was the most precious jar of honey he had ever received, and it meant more to him than all the honey in the world. When the time came for the sharing of the honey, Barlow hesitated for only a moment. He looked around at all the animals, each one a friend, each one a part of the family he had built over the past seasons. With a deep breath, he poured the honey into bowls and handed them around, feeling the warmth of the moment as he did. As the animals tasted the honey, their eyes lit up with delight. This is the best honey we've ever had, one of the rabbits exclaimed, her face glowing with joy. Barlow, this honey is more than just sweet. It's full of love. Barlow smiled, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't just the honey that was sweet, it was the love and kindness they had all shared in this moment. He had learned that sweetness didn't just come from the jar, it came from the heart. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the clearing, Barlow sat back and looked around. The forest had never seemed so alive, so full of love and laughter. The animals were dancing around the bonfire, their paws and hooves beating in time with the music. Thistle was at his side, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "This is what I've always wanted," Barlow said quietly. "This is what I was afraid of, being part of something so beautiful, so full of life. I thought I had to protect everything, keep it all to myself. But now I see that the real gift is in sharing." Thistle nodded, her smile gentle. "Yes, Barlow. The real gift is in giving, in being part of something bigger than ourselves. The forest is better because of you, because you chose to share your heart with us." Barlow looked out at the animals, who were all gathered together, sharing in the joy of the moment. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. He had found a place where he belonged, a place where sharing wasn't just an act, but a way of life. And as the night deepened and the stars twinkled above, Barlow knew that the forest would always be home, not because of the honey or the food or the songs, but because of the love and friendship they had all shared. In that moment, Barlow understood that the sweetness of life was never found in keeping things to yourself. It was found in giving, in sharing, and in being loved for exactly who you were. As the days following the Spring Festival passed, Barlow found himself quietly reflecting on the festival's success. He would often sit by the river, watching the gentle flow of water, pondering his journey. There was still a small part of him that felt shy, that old familiar sense of insecurity, but it was no longer as overwhelming. The weight of isolation that he had once carried so heavily in his heart had lightened, replaced by something new, a deep sense of gratitude. One afternoon, as he wandered near the forest's edge, Barlow came across an old weathered tree. Its bark was rough, its branches twisted, but its roots seemed to spread deep into the earth, holding it steady through countless seasons. Something about the tree resonated with Barlow. It wasn't perfect. Its bark had been scarred by time, its branches bent by storms, but it stood strong, unyielding. A thought bloomed in Barlow's heart. Just like that tree, he could stand firm in the face of his fears. In the days that followed, Barlow began to spend more time with the animals of the forest. He found himself drawn to those who were different, who had their own challenges to face. There was Gilly, the young fox who was afraid of the dark, and Pippa, the owl who could never find the right words when she tried to make friends. They were just like Barlow, struggling with their own fears and shyness, but wanting to connect. "Barlow," Gilly said one day, as they sat together under the shade of the trees, "I've always been afraid of speaking up. I can't help but worry that no one will like me if I say the wrong thing." Barlow nodded. "I used to think the same way," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to share my thoughts, my feelings. I was too afraid of rejection." Gilly looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "But now you're not scared anymore?" Barlow paused, thinking. "It's not that I'm not scared anymore. I still feel that fear sometimes. But I've learned that it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to make mistakes. What matters is being willing to try, to reach out, even when it feels scary." "Really?" Gilly asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Really," Barlow said, smiling. "You don't have to be perfect to share yourself with others. You just have to be real." Barlow's relationship with Gilly grew stronger as they shared their thoughts and fears. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when Barlow would retreat into his quiet corner of the forest, overwhelmed by the emotions swirling inside him. But with each conversation, each moment of vulnerability, he felt a little more whole. He realized that his past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. He wasn't just the shy, solitary bear he had once been. He was a bear who was learning, growing, and most importantly, connecting. One evening, as Barlow sat near the river, he heard the familiar flap of wings. Looking up, he saw Pippa, the owl, gliding gracefully toward him. She landed softly beside him, her large, expressive eyes shining with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. Barlow, Pippa began hesitantly, I've been thinking about what you said, about sharing and being real. Barlow smiled warmly, his heart opening at her words. What about it, Pippa? I've always felt so awkward when I'm around other animals, she confessed. I try to say the right things, but I often end up saying something wrong. I've been afraid that if I say too much, no one will want to be around me. Barlow's smile softened, and he gently nudged her wing with his paw. Pippa, you're not alone in feeling that way. I've felt the same fear. But sharing who you are, even in small ways, makes you more connected to others. And the more you share, the more you learn about them too. Pippa looked down at the ground, her feathers rustling softly. It's hard, though. I'm so used to hiding behind my silence. Barlow's eyes filled with empathy. I understand. I used to hide too. But when you open up, even just a little, you might find that others are waiting to share with you as well. Pippa took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something big. I want to try. I want to try to be more open, to speak up, even if I make mistakes. Barlow smiled, his heart swelling with pride. That's the spirit, Pippa. We're all on this journey together. The following weeks were filled with moments of growth and discovery. Barlow, Gilly, and Pippa spent more time together, each of them pushing past their fears, one small step at a time. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when they stumbled, but each time they did, they learned from it, laughing at their mistakes and offering support when one of them fell short. Barlow had learned that it wasn't about perfection. It was about trying, about being vulnerable, and about being willing to share even the smallest pieces of your heart. And as he shared more with his friends, he found that he was no longer afraid of being seen. His shyness didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled him. He had discovered that sharing wasn't just about giving away things. It was about sharing moments, feelings, and experiences, and in doing so, creating bonds that would last forever. One evening, as the forest glowed with the soft light of the setting sun, Barlow sat by the river with Thistle. She had been his first true friend in the forest, the one who had guided him through the darkest parts of his journey. Do you ever miss how things used to be? Thistle asked, her voice thoughtful. Barlow paused, looking out at the rippling water. I used to think I wanted to go back to the way things were, when I was alone, when I didn't have to worry about anyone else. And now? Thistle prompted. Now I wouldn't change a thing, Barlow said with a smile. I've learned that sharing doesn't just mean giving things away. It's about giving yourself, your time, your kindness, your heart. And it's the best thing I've ever done. Thistle smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. I'm proud of you, Barlow. You've come a long way. I couldn't have done it without you, Barlow replied. You were the first one to show me that sharing was okay. Together they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the evening sky. The forest around them was peaceful, full of life, and full of love. Barlow had finally found the place where he belonged, not because of what he had to offer, but because of who he was. The Spring Festival had sparked something deep inside the forest, a sense of community, of belonging, that hadn't been there before. It was as if the very heart of the forest had been awakened, and now everything was connected in a way that was more profound than ever before. Barlow no longer saw the forest as a place he had to hide from. It was a place where he was free to be himself, a place where his shy nature was not a weakness, but a part of his unique charm. And as the seasons changed once again, Barlow stood at the edge of the river, his heart full of gratitude. He knew there would still be times when he would feel afraid, still moments when his shyness would rise up, but now he understood that it wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was just a part of him, a part that didn't need to hold him back. He had learned to embrace it, to share it, and to be vulnerable in ways he had never thought possible. The forest was full of stories, stories of bravery, of friendship, and of the beauty that came from sharing. And now Barlow had his own story to tell, a story of a bear who was too shy to share, but who learned that the greatest gift in life was not in keeping everything for himself, but in sharing his heart with others.